Greetings, everyone. Dr. Childs here from Temple Bible College, Northern Kentucky University. Good to see y'all. I'm recording this near a couple days before the end of the new year. It's been a little while since we had an opportunity to record lectures. We're going to do chapter 6 today from our Black History class. Last time, if you remember, we did chapter 5. We talked about Give Me Liberty, and we basically dealt with the paradox of slavery and freedom. Paradox meaning the irony of a country that purports to talk about freedom, land of the free, home of the brave, and to be fighting for freedom during the Revolutionary War. At the same time, they held slaves. So we spent some time talking about that, and that hypocrisy was not lost to the slaves. The slaves pointed out the hypocrisy, as well as anti-slavery people, abolitionists. They pointed out the hypocrisy of a country that's supposedly fighting for independence from Britain, but at the same time, they owned slaves. We also dealt with very gifted and talented Africans during the time of the 1700s. Black folks weren't all just slaves, and contrary to popular belief, they were not ignorant. They were very intelligent. We talked about the poet Phyllis Wheatley, and the Black poet. You can find some of her work. She was very gifted and talented. And we talked about Barzalai. He was a fifist, an instrumentalist during the time of the American Revolution. And we looked at, I'm drawing a blank, a famous sculptor at that particular time. When I come up with the name, I'll tell you. Famous woman sculptor, Edmonia Lewis. And we talked about the role that slaves played in the American Revolution and how they fought in the American Revolution. There was first a debate. George Washington, he had some racist ways. He had some. He thought blacks were inferior, and he felt like that African Americans were not capable of fighting in the war. Well, I think he knew. I think they just didn't want to give African Americans guns. I think that's the main thing. They didn't want to give African American guns for obvious reasons. They would turn the guns on their captors, and that's what everybody was afraid of. So, but once the British offered freedom to any blacks that fought in the war, and then Washington and others changed their tune and said, okay, well, we'll go ahead and allow y'all to fight black folks. Y'all fight for us, okay? So I think I'm going to, in the interest of time, we're going to pull up chapter 6 here. This is the lecture here. Now, I'll probably retext you all of the lecture. I think that's probably what I'll do. If you have trouble finding those lectures, I'll go ahead and retext those out to y'all so you can go back and look at them. I know it's been a while since we met. We're going to just go ahead and meet in January. Some folk were sick. But we're going to go ahead and meet in January to pick back up where we left off. So let's go into chapter 6, okay? Building communities in the early republic. And when we say early republic, we mean after the Revolutionary War. The war was fought. We are newly the United States of America. So these dates will be after probably the late 1700s. So we're going to kind of get into that as well. Let's look at some demographics though. What was the population, the census in the 1780? Let me see if it'll let me turn on my slideshow. Perfect, okay. So you see here in the, let me make sure that my volume is doing well. I just got kind of concerned to make sure my volume is doing right. Yep, we're good to go. All right, let me move forward, 'cause I got a lot of material to deal with. We see the black population, the census of 1790. In other words, what was the African-American population in the United States in 1790? We had just become a nation. So when I say early republic, that's what I mean. We'll look at the various black communities. So in Maine, you had 537 free blacks because slavery was abolished. You had 157 slaves in New Hampshire. So most people don't think about slaves being in New Hampshire, but they were in 1630. You had a large number. If you look at Massachusetts here, you had a large number of free blacks. So Boston had a pretty large number, the city of Boston and the state of Massachusetts at 5,369 free blacks, okay? So the largest number of slaves would have been in Virginia, 292,627. But also look at the number of free blacks in Virginia. So most people may not realize that even in the South, you had a number of free blacks, even in states like Virginia. I can't remember if we talked about it, but free blacks, one of the common ways for African Americans to win their freedom was they purchased their own freedom, or sometimes the slave master would grant them their freedom. Okay, so let's move on. African Americans in demographic perspective. Demographics means the numbers. Okay, what type, how many people lived in a certain region, where did they live, what they do for a living. It's statistics, okay? That's what demographics is. The mid-Atlantic states. So we're gonna look at the various regions. So black people weren't all the same all throughout the United States. It depends on what region they lived in. Remember, if you wanna write down, we're in the late 1700s, okay? Then we're gonna move forward from there. But the way of life of black people depend on what region they're in. So let's look at the mid-Atlantic states in New England. Gradual abolition law. So mid-Atlantic meaning in New England, going back to this chart here, this will be New England, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. These states, what we would call the East Coast today. But gradual abolitionist laws, what that means is there were laws that said they would eventually free slaves. But slavery persisted. By the eve of the Civil War, there were no slaves in the North, okay? So in some parts, slavery persisted, but by the eve of the Civil War, no slaves existed in the North. That is Ohio, New Hampshire, etc. and so forth. Slavery did not end in Delaware until after the Civil War. Which I never knew that. I never knew that. Wow. For some reason that slipped my mind. I had read this before, but wow. New England ahead of other regions in abolition of slavery. So why do you think New England was ahead of other regions? Again, we're talking Maine, New Hampshire, the New York area. Why do you think they were quicker to abolish slavery than in the South? Of course, the answer is that the South needed them more. They needed larger quantity of slaves. Why? Of course, you know, because of farming. In the deep South, like Georgia, South Carolina, you had these large plantations. They needed more slave labor. Slavery persisted west of the Southern Appalachians. So, slide 4 here: development of black communities during that time period, right after the United States gained their freedom from England and became independent. Timing and character of abolition was important in building black communities. They developed rapidly in cities, especially in the North. And so in sheer numbers, I'm on page 104, in sheer numbers, the South's free black population was larger than the North's. But in proportion to the slave population, the number of free blacks in the South was minuscule, a mere 32,048 alongside 641,691 slaves. So that's that chart we looked at. I had talked about that already. Now, I do want to say something about Delaware again. Delaware was the only mid-Atlantic state that failed to legislate in favor of emancipation, although the number of slaves there declined significantly relative to the number of free blacks. In 1790, Delaware had a black population of nearly 13,000, of which slaves more than doubled the free blacks. By 1810, the state's total population of African Americans stood at over 17,000, with more than 3/4 of them free, most from private acts of manumission. Remember, the word manumission means freedom, okay? When slaves are free. Although Delaware's slave population declined over the next 3 decades, at least 13%, 2,605, of the black population remained in slavery in 1840. Slavery would not end in Delaware until after the Civil War. We talked about that. Okay, let me get to where we are. Development of the black communities. I wanted to go back. The timing and character of abolition were crucial to the process of building black communities. Community institutions, I'm on page 106 at the bottom. Community institutions developed most rapidly in cities, especially in the North, where the slave codes of the colonial era had either been abolished or were on the wane. Slave codes were laws passed to restrict the movement of African Americans. It really violated their civil rights. But even where free status prevailed, blacks endured economic discrimination and social ostracization. So even when blacks were free, understand this, just because blacks were free does not mean they were free from discrimination. So if I had won my freedom or purchased my freedom or been granted my freedom, I was still discriminated against because of the color of my skin. So just because a person is anti-slavery doesn't mean they're not prejudiced, okay? African Americans gravitated to East Coast cities. Also, this was the time of white migration. Occupational opportunity varied from place to place. In Boston, blacks compressed to lower economic ranks. So even though blacks were free in Boston, there was no slavery by this time, African Americans were relegated to low-paying jobs. It's kind of like the South now. Often you'll see some parts of the South, you'll see where it's difficult for African Americans to rise up to high-level positions. And not just in the South, here in the Midwest, sometimes you'll have, like you talk about city council or politics, you have all-white city council and African Americans. It takes a lot to break through that color barrier. Even with myself, as a tenured black professor, I was the first one in the history of my department to get tenure. So often blacks can get low-paying jobs. You'll see that a lot when you go to McDonald's, White Castle, the mall. Blacks will have access to low-paying jobs, but it's more difficult to get to the higher-paying jobs, higher status. And that was the case with Boston. There was a lot of black migration to Boston. Early abolition in Massachusetts spurred black migration to Boston. So Massachusetts was one of the earlier states to allow slaves to be free and allow blacks to be free, enslaved blacks. And so therefore, when African Americans heard that slavery was illegal in Massachusetts, many of them migrated that way. But as I said, they couldn't find good jobs often, found unskilled jobs. In 1788, Massachusetts legislature passed measures to prevent black immigration from other states. And so in order for Massachusetts became uncomfortable with all the black folks flocking to their state, so they began to pass laws in 1788 that restricted the movement of blacks and put a limit on how many African Americans could come to Boston. And to this day, you have a majority white population there. Although there's a number of African Americans there, the whites outnumber the blacks because of these early laws. And we're talking about how African Americans, their way of life differs in various regions of the United States, okay? Blacks in Philadelphia. Early rise in the black community attributed to the fact Pennsylvania first state to pass emancipation law, okay? Pennsylvania was the first state, although Massachusetts was early on to do pass laws against slavery and abolishing slavery. Pennsylvania was the first. And so because Pennsylvania was the first, we're here. And this part of the notes. there was a early rise of Black community and culture. Now, Philadelphia was different from Boston because it created Black urban institutions, although majority of the jobs remain unskilled. So that's similar. I'm sorry, I misspoke. So even though they had Black urban institutions like Boston, there still remained majority of the Blacks that were in unskilled jobs. They were pushed out of the economy and not allowed to get some of the skilled jobs, even though they were qualified. That's a popular myth that the reason, even today, that African Americans are in high skilled positions because they're not qualified. That's a stereotype. So New York City's Black community, slavery was legal until 1799. So in New York, you had, by the 1800s, slavery was illegal. When we talk about slave history, we talk about African American history, often in our mind, we think about slavery in the South. What I want to keep reiterating here is that slavery existed in the North as well, but it just died out quicker because slaves were not as needed in the North and in urban settings. Even though well, let me move on. Free population grew larger during this time in New York, many coming from surrounding countryside and the Upper South. Mostly performed unskilled labor, some were artisans. When I say artisans, that is actually skilled labor, but just like Boston and Philadelphia, after manumission or after the abolishment of slavery in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, you still had most of the African Americans were performing unskilled jobs. Okay, so let me just move on here. Building community institutions. Building community institutions were the cornerstone of the Black communities. They emerged as a result of Blacks' desire to participate in shared cultural traditions. So, for example, one of the most important institutions, and still to this day, was the Black church. Often when it was illegal to educate Blacks or Blacks struggled to get an education, the church was the organization that pushed education and facilitated an environment where African Americans could get an education. Black churches were organized in both the North and the South. As a result of First Great Awakening revivals, they attracted a lot of African Americans to evangelical anti-slavery. Methodists and Baptists were the foremost organizations during that time that attracted African Americans. The Great Awakening was this religious revival. We had the First and Second Great Awakening. The First Awakening was when the Holy Spirit just moved throughout the region, the United States, and in England, and really drew a lot of people to the Lord, and it was challenging some of the old ways because churches had become dead. And so the Great Awakening really brought that fire back, and it attracted a lot of African Americans. And what I was saying earlier was primarily the Methodists and the Baptists. The religious revival is known as the First Great Awakening that began in the 1740s in New England and reached the South in 1770s through the 1790s, brought Blacks increasingly into the evangelical fold of the Methodists and Baptists, many of whom were anti-slavery advocates. At interracial revivals, Blacks as preachers and as converts wept and shouted in ecstatic worship alongside whites. In the narrative of his life, Black Methodist minister John Merritt recalled being struck to the ground, quote unquote, speechless and senseless, when listening to the great English preacher George Whitefield in late 1769 or early 1770 in Charleston. As a result of his conversion experience, Merritt became a preacher who proselytized among both Native Americans and African Americans. Likewise, this is, page 109 in our text. Likewise, slave-born Richard Allen was drawn into Methodism outside Dover, Pennsylvania, after hearing the charismatic and anti-slavery white preacher Freeborn Garrison. Indeed, Garrison persuaded Allen's owner of the sinfulness of slavery, making it possible for Allen to buy his freedom. Allen's own preaching abilities drew him to the Methodist circuit, where he became known to the leading evangelical preachers of his day. Traveling to South Carolina, to New York, and to Indian lands and the Appalachians, Allen exhorted interracial audiences. After moving to Philadelphia in 1786, he continued to preach and to conduct prayer meetings specifically for Black Philadelphians, while earning his living as a shoemaker. In 1787, Absalom Jones, a member of his Black prayer group, joined Allen and other slaves in forming the African Free Society. So let me get caught up here on my notes. I was getting ahead of myself. The first Black-owned church was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first Black denomination. Before that, most of the denominations, unless you were talking about independent Baptist, before that, all denominations were white-owned, and you had Blacks within that denomination. African Methodist Episcopal Church was founded by Black folks. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were a part of the Methodist Church at first, but they decided to break away from St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church after being directed to sit in the balcony under a new segregated seating policy. The story goes that they were literally pulled off their knees. They were praying in the white section, and they didn't realize it was a white section, and they were physically pulled off of their knees by white officers, by white church members as a result of racism. So from that point, all of the Black folks left St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church and founded the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, as a result of that. Methodist General Council attempted to control Allen's new church, but they could not. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision led way for this first Black-led denomination. The AME Church grew with branches as far as Pittsburgh and Charleston. And so just to slow down a little bit, the AME Church started in Philadelphia, okay, in Pennsylvania, and then it spread throughout the country. And we still have it to this day. So it wasn't like Blacks said, African Americans said, we're just gonna start our own church, but they had to, because they didn't want to experience racism while they were worshiping the Lord. Separate Black institutions, community and associations institutions created urban Black leadership class based on common values. Boston School Committee's 1812 decision to subsidize Black schools was the root of Boston's segregated system. And so they agreed to fund Boston schools in 1812, but it made for segregated schools. Well before it achieved denominational status in 1816, the AME Church had branches springing up in Baltimore. I want to say a little bit more about the AME Church before I go to the schools. Page 110. They had branches springing up in Baltimore, Wilmington, and various Pennsylvania and New Jersey towns. Allen was able to enlist the aid of a number of able persons such as Daniel Coker, Nicholson Gilliard, and Morris Brown, which there's a historically Black college named after him. By 1820, Philadelphia alone had 4,000 Black Methodists. And in Baltimore district, there were almost 2,000. The denomination spread as far west as Pittsburgh and as far south as Charleston. In the late 18th and 19th century, the building of separate Black community institutions. Let me say more about this. This is where we are now. And associations, mutual aid societies, fraternal lodges, schools, and churches was creating a visible urban Black leadership class. I want to also point out before I get into this, in those days it was more common for Black preachers to pastor or minister to all white congregations. You don't see it as much now. You'll see white congregations, you'll see white pastors with a lot of black members, but you don't see as much a black pastor with an all-white church or majority white church because of racism still persists. But in those days, during the Great Awakening, from the 1740s to 1790s, you often would see black ministers ministering to all-white congregations because ministers were not as plentiful as they are now. So in the late 1800s and early 19th century, there was this building of separate black institutions. For example, these path-breaking organizations reflected a common set of values that included respectability among the black community and moral uplift, literacy, and cultural achievement and economic advancement, and racial self-determination. All of these were values. Racial self-determination was important because what that means is we can be free and on our own and not have to depend on a white establishment. Cultural achievement had to do with black excellence, moral uplift, doing the right thing, respectability, economic advancement, the wealth of blacks. All these were core values that undergirded the building of these new institutions. For example, the first black fraternal organization was the African Masonic Lodge in America, founded in Boston under the leadership of Prince Hall. We still have Prince Hall Masons today. Hall was among 15 free blacks initiated into Masonry by British soldiers during the occupation of Boston in 1775. So he also had schools. Boston's black leadership class sparked a petition for an African school in 1787. The Boston public schools, called free schools, were not segregated by law, but in practice, black children were denied access to them. Petitions from the black parents led to authorization of a school, but on the condition that funds to support it were privately secured. In 1798, black Bostonians raised money to employ a teacher. Several influential whites assisted in obtaining these funds, including William Emerson, the father of the future philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, and William Thornton Kirkland, who would later become the president of Harvard College. Even so, it would take another 8 years to secure an actual schoolhouse. In the meantime, the home of black Bostonian Primus Hall served to this purpose. In 1812, the Boston School Committee, the city school board, finally agreed, and I said this earlier, to the African school and annual subsidy. But by doing so, it assumed complete control of black education and thus gave Boston a racially segregated school system. All right, let me go in the interest of time. White philanthropy, what that means is the financial support by wealthy whites that supported the black institution. The problem often was the struggle over control. When whites were in leadership and they funded black institutions, a lot of times the whites would want to dictate to blacks how to run the institution. That's why there was always this fight, even today, to have our own resources, and our own property, et cetera, and so forth. So African Americans were involved in politics, blacks in American party politics. Disenfranchisement, that word means to deny black the vote, deny African Americans the vote. Disenfranchisement. Franchisement means vote, to have the ability to vote. Disenfranchisement means to take that away. And there's still debate about that today. Voter suppression. I can't talk today. Voter suppression, and trying to stop certain populations from voting because it changes the course of the election. Often voter suppression has historically affected blacks. State legislators often opened up voting for white men by abolishing property restrictions, but many of the statutes disenfranchised black men, again, took their votes away. Free black property holders found it increasingly more difficult to vote. So there was this discrimination between who could vote, because obviously if African American, they understood African American vote is powerful. We see that with the Biden election. It was the black folks that really got Biden in office gave him that edge. He had a record number of black votes during the 2020 election. Black vote was an issue in the increasing political partisanship in 1790s. Federalists were more likely to oppose slavery, be sympathetic to the role of blacks as citizens. So the Federalists was an early political party back then. They were anti-slavery, and they were also, let's just say, less prejudiced. During this same time, you had the Haitian Revolution that was going on also as African Americans were trying to gain their freedom. Haiti is not a part of Africa, it's in the Caribbean. A lot of people think because Haitians are black, that they're in Africa. No, they're in the Caribbean, on the same island as the Dominican Republic, the same region as Cuba and Bahamas and those regions in the Caribbean. But after a long struggle, Haiti became the world's first black republic. American politics were divided over the Haitian Revolution. Federalists tended to support the Haitian Revolution. So in other words, some Americans did not think this black republic should have their freedom. You know, that makes sense because many of those same Americans did not think African Americans should have. Many of those white Americans also did not think African Americans should have their freedom. And so they also, of course, did not support Haiti's freedom. Okay, their prejudice went beyond our borders, but they didn't want no black people to have freedom. Okay, so, but God bless that Haiti became the first black republic. Toussaint Louverture was one of the leading figures in helping Haiti get their freedom. He was the leader of the Haitian Revolution against France. Okay, well, let me see. I'll maybe share a little bit about Toussaint. Page 113, last paragraph. The intrepid leader of the black and mulatto rebel forces of Haiti was the able and experienced soldier Toussaint Louverture, who by 1800 was at the height of his power. France's new ruler, Napoleon Bonaparte, however, regarded Toussaint as an obstacle to his plan to create a great empire. So that's another thing too. Napoleon was the leader at that time when they were in. I should point out that the reason Haitians speak a creolized French is because they were dominated by French. They were ruled by France until their freedom, until they won their freedom in 1804. And from Napoleon and the French. Okay, my brain is not working today. Louisiana Purchase. So this is going to expand the size of the United States. The purchase of Louisiana was also connected with the trouble in the Caribbean. Democratic Republican leader Thomas Jefferson gave voice to slaveholders' fears when he called the revolutionary slaves of Haiti cannibals. And so Thomas Jefferson was also a racist. And their combustion as a threat to slavery in the United States. When Jefferson assumed the presidency in 1801, he broke all formal relations with the rebel government. So Thomas Jefferson did not even recognize Haiti as a form of government because he was mad that those black people had gained their own freedom because it was looked bad on America that owned slaves. I'm just telling it like it is. France's reacquisition of Louisiana from Spain in 1800 had greatly disturbed him. Since in 1795, the new republic had negotiated a satisfactory arrangement with Spain for navigation of the Mississippi River. So that's all I want to say there. I don't want to get too much into that. Free black voters preferred Federalists because of prominence in early anti-slavery societies. Not all Federalists were critical of slavery, so you had a division in the Federalist Party. Again, you know how we have Democrats and Republicans today. A prominent political party during that time were Federalists, and the Southern Federalists, of course, supported slavery. The party's northern base committed to the growth of cities, manufacturing, and maritime trade. So it makes sense, once again, in the South, it made sense for the people, the political folks, to support slavery because slavery brought more wealth to the South. And the North did not need as many slaves, so they focused more on the cities, manufacturing, the sea trade, maritime trade, open jobs for urbanized free Black population, and plus slavery was illegal by then in most northern cities. So the Federalists in the North was against slavery. The Federalists in the South supported slavery. Election contentions, Federalists courted Blacks in Boston to counterbalance Democratic, Republican, Irish immigrants. Blacks were intimidated at the polling places, so that's nothing new. I like this section because it deals with Black writing and art in the new nation. Why do I like it? Because often when we study African American history, we study the negativity of it. We focus just on slavery, and we miss the brilliance that God gave the Black community. We miss out on all these cool things that Blacks did. Blacks adopted various literary forms to define position in relation to dominant white society. So Black African Americans were writing about these issues. In the early Republic, Blacks began to adopt various literary forms. I'm on page 116 at the top, at their own position in relation to the dominant white society, deferential pleading, defiant protest, pride of heritage, spiritual autobiography. These were all the different types of writing styles. And my interest, of course, as a pastor and as a Christian, is these spiritual autobiographies. People would write in those days about how their conversion, how they came to Christ. There was various writing literary forms. That's what I mean by that. Defiant protest, there was literature that protested the pride of heritage, so African pride. Phyllis Wheatley's death, the poet I talked about earlier, in 1784 prevents her inclusion among the post-revolutionary Black writers, but significant among this group. Post-revolutionary means these Black folks that were writing after the American Revolution, okay? So you can find these writings today, and it's pretty easy to find on the internet. Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, James Fortin, Prince Hall, the founder of Freemasonry. Remember Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were the founder of the AME Church, first Black-owned church, Black-founded church in the country. Benjamin Banneker, Alauda Aquilina, Prince Hall. I said him already. Daniel Coker, Venture Smith. Their writings also link African American communities with others of African descent in the Atlantic world, reflecting a racial consciousness that we call today Pan-Africanism, and would be recognized today as diaspora perspective, since the writers often intended their words to speak for dispersed Black worldwide. So when Blacks began to write in the United States, it connected them to other other Africans throughout the world. African Americans in Boston voiced their concerns and protests in the form of what today we call op-ed articles in urban newspapers. For example, when Boston's Independent Ledger referred to the African Masonic Lodge as St. Black's Lodge and chided Blacks for improperly using Masonic rituals, Prince Hall, the lodge's Grand Master, retorted that our title was not St. Black's Lodge, neither do we aspire with after higher titles. So he protested against that racism. They were speaking against Black Masons, basically saying that they were inferior. Negative images of African Americans were conspicuous in newspapers, but in these same papers, free Blacks also registered their protests. Not until 1827, with the appearance of the first Black edited newspaper, Freedom's Journal, did Blacks obtain a powerful alternative. So we began to have our own newspaper by 1827, our own journals. Pamphlet literature usually published orations, countered racist depictions of Blacks in dominant society's print media. So literature contributed a lot to racism in the white-owned newspapers and publications. They were constantly pointing out blacks as derogatory and perpetuating stereotypes. But to counter that, African Americans began to do their own writings and to come against that and protest against it. There was a commemoration of the end of slave trade accompanied by annual celebrations. That was something that African Americans valued that white publications would not have picked up on because they really didn't care about that. I'll give you an example of a spiritual autobiography I mentioned earlier on page 118. Another important form of Black letters was the spiritual autobiography. One of the first Blacks to write of his search for intellectual and spiritual independence was Jupiter Hammond, a Long Island slave whose writings spanned from the colonial period to the first decade of the Republic. Growing into manhood during the years when the Wesleyan religious revival movement was strong both in England and America, Hammond was greatly influenced by the writings of Charles Wesley and William Cowper. He published an evening thought, Salvation by Christ, with penitential cries as a broadside in 1760, and a 21-stanza poem to Miss Phyllis Wheatley. Other poems and prose pieces by him appeared during the next 2 decades. In an address to Negroes of the state of New York, published in 1787, Hammond confessed to feeling a personal Christian duty to bear slavery patiently, while at the same time acknowledging the evil of the institution. So that's an example. Then there's the narrative of Alauda Equiana, which is actually an account. Now, that's a book I have too, an account of him on the Middle Passage coming from Africa to the United States. Okay, and you can find that on page 119 if you want to go back and check that out. It mentions his autobiography at the top of 119. Okay, so let me pause and say, if you have questions, let me know. You can text me or email me, or leave a comment in the on the YouTube video. That's actually better for me. More on Black writing and art in the New Nations. Appeals to readers. Success of pamphlets as a vehicle of social transformation depend on wide appeal to readers. Black leaders defended claims for equal citizenship. Africa as a center of Black heritage became a theme. This is in the pamphlets that African Americans wrote. So let me just kind of put this in context, historical context. Nowadays, people use blogs and Facebook and social media to get their thoughts out, even YouTube like we're doing now. But in those days, the only medium we had was paper. And often, let me find my water. Often, they would voice their thoughts, political views, spiritual thoughts through pamphlets, through a popular vehicle. The Jones and Allen pamphlet, these were the gentlemen that founded the AME Church, the ones, you remember, that were pulled off of their knees. They were the first Blacks to receive a copyright for a pamphlet, defended Black communities and behavior during the 1793 yellow fever epidemic. Pamphleteers attempted to replace, this was what I was saying earlier, this is important. Pamphleteers attempted to replace negative racial images with group images of respectability and wanted to paint Blacks in a more positive light. They also engaged in internal community policing. So if people got out of hand in the Black community, the pamphlets was an opportunity to call them out. Okay, this is what I kind of jump ahead of myself. We talked about the spiritual autobiography with Jupiter Hammond and Alauda Equiana. Since I mentioned Equiana earlier, I'll say a little bit more about this. Page 119. During this period, the most widely reprinted book in English by a person of African descent was the interesting narratives of the life of Alauda Equiana, or Gustavus Vassa, first published in England in 1789. It was immediately successful. And then within 5 years, 8 editions have been issued in America and England. There can be no doubt about Equiana's resentment of slavery, for his narrative For in his narrative, he vigorously condemns Christians for their enslavement of blacks. This would fit in the tradition. This will fit in the traditional spiritual autobiography. He says, "O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you? Why are parents to lose their children, brothers and sisters or husbands, their wives? Surely this is a new refinement in cruelty." He's talking about slavery. This is a critique of slavery in his book, which while it was no advantage to atone for it, thus aggravates distress and adds fresh horrors even to the wretchedness of slavery. And so, along with that, this is the gentleman, as I mentioned, that wrote about his experience being kidnapped in Africa and brought over to the United States. Benjamin Banneker, another well-known figure. He was very intelligent. He made these almanacs. The United States during the early national period, the most accomplished black man of letters was Benjamin Banneker. Born in 1731 in Maryland of thrifty and industrious parents, Banneker attended a private school open to whites and blacks near Baltimore and developed a keen interest in science and mathematics. While still a young man, he astounded his family and neighbors by constructing a clock from wooden materials. This display of mechanical genius attracted the attention of George Ellicott, a Quaker who had moved into the neighborhood to establish a flour mill. Banneker frequently, I'm on page 119 at the bottom. Banneker frequently visited Ellicott's mill while they were being built, and his general knowledge of the mathematical and engineering problems drew the two men close together. Soon Ellicott began to lend Banneker books on mathematics and astronomy. Within a few weeks, Banneker had not only mastered the material in the books, but had even discovered several errors in the author's calculations. By 1789, he had become so proficient in astronomy that he could predict a solar eclipse with considerable accuracy. In 1791, Banneker began issuing his almanacs, an enterprise that he continued until 1802. Almanacs which require elaborate and precise mathematical calculations were essential for farmers and mariners because they gave the times of high tide and low tide, the rising and setting of the sun. Among the most prominent men attracted by his black poor, let me rephrase that, or let me say that slowly. Among the most prominent men attracted by this quote unquote black poor Richard was James McHenry, later President John Adams, Secretary of War. Through McHenry, Banneker was able to establish a number of important connections with officials without the least information or assistance from any person or from any other books that Banneker himself furnished. So he was pretty prominent. The highest honor that Banneker received was appointment as a surveyor to define the boundary lines and lay out the streets of the District of Columbia. So Columbia, D.C. So a black man laid out the boundary lines in the streets of Washington, D.C. And that was none other than Benjamin Banneker. I'm an artist myself, and so I'm really interested in the work of the painter Joshua Johnston. Folks, I always like to point out when we're talking about African-American history, the accomplishments of African-Americans, we weren't just a bunch of poor folk with our head down that were ignorant and unlearned. The Lord blessed us to be a great people. And Joshua Johnston was among those individuals. Imagine this, back in the late 1700s, a painter, the early 1800s, a painter, Joshua Johnston. There's a portrait that he did on page 129 called Portrait of a Gentleman. It believed to be a portrait of the Reverend Daniel Coker, a famous, well-known pastor at that time, white pastor. War of 1812. This was the second war that we fought with Britain. There was a lot of blacks that performed military service during the War of 1812. Northern black communities pledged allegiance to the U.S. government. New York passed Act passed an act for recruitment of 2 black regiments. They were promised the same pay as white soldiers. They promised freedom to slaves who enlisted with permission of the master. The Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia called on black leaders to mobilize the community. More than 2,500 blacks helped to erect defenses against Britain. Of course, there were gallant African Americans fighting in the war, their gallant service. Soldiers of color were instrumental in the victory at the Battle of New Orleans. You can see on page 122 a painting of the Battle of New Orleans. General Jackson was pleased to have blacks serve in the War of 1812. He is shown here commanding black troops at the Battle of New Orleans. They're on page 122. African Americans also fought on the side of the British. British also, of course, as you may have guessed, promised freedom to fugitive slaves. That's the painting I was referring to. Battle of New Orleans. You can see African Americans there. They served in the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson is shown commanding black troops. Black colonization efforts. There was a movement of African Americans who felt like America was so terrible that it was just best to begin our own settlement, our own black settlement. So this is a whole movement. This is what Marcus Garvey talked about in the 20th century, the Back to Africa movement. There were black settlements. Black settlement outside of the U.S. appealed to different groups for different reasons. Escaped slaves were looking for a place to live free. And you had these individual communities called maroon communities, where African Americans escaped in groups and founded their own communities, for example, back in the swamps for years and years and years. And they had their own military, and when the whites would try to come and overthrow them, they fought them off. Black religious leaders wanted to go back to Africa for missionary purposes. Proponents of slavery wanted to remove free blacks to secure slavery. That's from the white perspective. Many anti-slavery whites supported colonization because of difficulty of races to live in harmony. So you have various reasons on why black folks or why people wanted independent black settlements. William Thornton was a part of the earliest campaign of colonization to Africa. His ideas were, this is a Caucasian gentleman, white guy. His ideas were based on the belief that races could not live together peacefully. Paul Cuffey, man of mixed African and Indian descent who owned and built ships, proposed to establish immigration and trade relations with Sierra Leone. With James Forten's help, he established a friendly society, that is Paul Cuffey, of Sierra Leone in Philadelphia. They sailed to Freetown in 1815 from Boston with 38 black immigrants at his own expense. That's the image of Paul Cuffey. There were mixed feelings on black colonization. Again, when we say black colonization, we mean Africans, black people established their own country, their own region, separate from the United States. African American Colonization Society, it was made of a mix of slaveholders and abolitionists. So slaveholders, of course, like I said earlier, wanted free blacks gone to secure the institution of slavery. Abolitionists felt like it was so terrible for blacks that we could never have freedom in the United States. Some still feel like that today. The colony of Liberia was formed as a result of his efforts. Liberia still exists today in Africa as a part of this movement. It was made up of blacks that migrated from the United States to Africa. They started Liberia. But there was, of course, black opposition. Philadelphia blacks negatively responded to colonization because in Massachusetts, slavery was not even legal anymore. So you had all of the blacks were free there. So of course they opposed. They said, we're not going anywhere. This is our home. Black opposition grew in many cities. Whether to stay or leave America continued to be a debate in Black communities throughout the antebellum period. Antebellum meaning before slavery, before the Civil War. War is bellum. The word bellum means war, ante means before. So when you see antebellum, that means before the Civil War. Liberty, the cause of liberty became contagious and it began to spread. In Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia, August 30th, 1800, more than 1,000 Blacks participated in a failed attempt to rebel with purpose of negotiating the end of slavery. So Black folks didn't just sit there quietly. They tried to literally overthrow the whole institution of slavery. Conspirators influenced by Haitian Revolution news from other parts of the world, from Black sailors and the arrival of French-speaking slaves and slave owners, that influenced African Americans to rebel, and ultimately they influenced Gabriel's Rebellion. There were many plots and rumors, and whites were scared. There was unrest among slaves. It continued until 1801. So that's all we're going to do today. I'm so grateful to be able to share this time with you. I encourage you just to pause it, and there are things I may not have covered as much as you would have liked. Go back into the book and look at those questions. You can give me a call too, or a text, and we can talk further if there's something that you didn't understand. But I'm going to just close out right here. We're going to do chapter 7, either online or in person, most likely online here. But you need to go ahead and get caught up. I haven't gotten work from everybody, so make sure you're getting caught up. Thank you. God bless y'all, and I'll see you next time.